1 million people, no police force, no streetlights, no emergency number to call, and somehow, Rome functioned. Not perfectly, not safely, but it functioned. The question is how? Because here's what nobody tells you about ancient Rome at its peak. It was not the gleaming marble city of the movies. It was loud, packed, filthy, and extraordinarily dangerous after dark. The streets were so narrow that two carts couldn't pass each other. The apartment buildings, called insulae, were so tall and so poorly built that they collapsed regularly, burying entire families in rubble while they slept. Fires started almost every week. Gangs controlled entire neighborhoods. And the only thing standing between 1 million people and complete chaos was a system so ingenious, so coldly calculated, so layered with psychological and physical control mechanisms that modern urban planners still study it today. This is not a story about laws written on stone tablets. This is a story about what actually happened. On the ground, in the dark, in the alleys and the markets, and the burning tenements where 1 million people were trying to survive each other. Let's go back, all the way back, to the most dangerous city in the ancient world. Rome in the 1st century AD was not one city. It was 3 cities stacked on top of each other. The first city was the Rome of the powerful, senators, equestrians, wealthy merchants. They lived in private domus houses with internal courtyards, their own water supplies, their own private security. Slaves and freedmen guarded their doors. Their neighborhoods were wider, better maintained, with access to the aqueducts that brought clean water from the hills. Crime still happened here, but it happened quietly, with knives rather than clubs, in the form of political assassination and poison wine at dinner parties. Sophisticated crime, well-dressed crime. The second city was the Rome of the Middle. Shopkeepers, craftsmen, the minor freedmen who ran the city's commercial life. They lived in the lower floors of the insulae, where the rent was higher but the risk of death was lower, because if the building collapsed, the ground floor had a better chance. They had some security. They had guilds. They had community. But the third city, the Rome of the poor, was something else entirely. The poor of Rome lived in the upper floors of apartment buildings that rose 6, 7, sometimes 8 stories into the Roman sky. Buildings with no running water, no sanitation, no fire safety of any kind. They carried water up from street-level fountains every single day. They cooked on open braziers, small portable fire pits, inside wooden buildings packed with 100 other people. The fire risk was not theoretical. It was constant. They walked streets after dark without any artificial light, except what leaked from tavern windows and the occasional torch at a wealthy man's door. The streets of Rome had no public lighting. None. After sunset, the city transformed into something genuinely terrifying. A maze of near-total darkness where visibility dropped to a few feet in any direction. Juvenal, the Roman satirist, described walking the nighttime streets of Rome as something a man had to be insane or suicidal to do without an escort. He wrote that you were a fool to go to dinner without having first written your will. He was not entirely joking. So how did Rome keep this from becoming complete anarchy? The answer is a system, and it operated on 3 distinct levels, each one more sophisticated than the last. The first level was the oldest and the most Roman, social control through community. Rome's neighborhoods were called vici, and each vicus was more than just a geographic area. It was a social institution with its own identity, its own religious shrines at street corners, its own elected officials called vicomagistri. These were not police. They were neighborhood leaders, often freedmen, men who had once been slaves and had earned their freedom, who now held a position of genuine local authority and genuine local respect. They knew everyone in their vicus. They knew who belonged and who didn't. They knew which faces were familiar and which were strangers moving through. There were 265 of these vici in Rome at the height of the empire. 265 distinct neighborhood units, each with its own internal social order. Think about what that meant in practice. A criminal operating in a Roman neighborhood wasn't navigating anonymous urban space. He was operating inside a tightly knit social web where everyone recognized faces and everyone talked. The Vico Magistri collected information constantly, not as formal intelligence gathering, but simply as part of knowing their community. Who was new? Who had money they didn't have before? Who had been seen somewhere they shouldn't be? This was surveillance by familiarity, and it was extraordinarily effective for preventing the kind of casual opportunistic crime that plagues cities where anonymity is easy. But it had limits. It couldn't stop organized crime. It couldn't stop the gangs. It couldn't stop the fires. And it absolutely could not function after dark, when the streets emptied of respectable people and filled with something else entirely. For that, Rome needed something more organized. The second level of Rome's crime control was the vigiles. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating. Augustus, the first Roman emperor, the man who turned a broken republic into a functioning empire, understood something that no Roman leader before him had fully grasped. A city of 1 million people was not a city anymore. It was a logistical and security problem of a scale that voluntary community organization couldn't solve. He needed a professional force. In 6 AD, Augustus created the Vigiles Urbani, the urban watchmen, 7,000 men, organized into 7 cohorts of 1,000 each. Each cohort assigned responsibility for 2 of Rome's 14 administrative regions. 7,000 men. For context, that is larger than the police force of many modern medium-sized cities. For a city in 6 AD, it was extraordinary, unprecedented. Nothing like it had existed anywhere in the ancient world at that scale. But here is what made the Vigiles genuinely clever and genuinely Roman in their pragmatism. They were not primarily a police force. They were primarily a fire brigade. This was not a compromise. This was a stroke of administrative genius. Because the 2 greatest threats to public order in ancient Rome were not, in the end, crime and violence. They were fire and the chaos that fire created. A building fire in 1st century Rome could spread to 50 structures in an hour. The buildings were wooden frames covered with plaster, packed together with almost no gaps, in a city with no building codes and no fire breaks. A fire that started in a tavern on one street could consume an entire neighborhood by morning. The Vigiles were equipped and trained for this. They carried buckets, the sipho hand pump, essentially a large syringe that could project a stream of water. They carried axes and hooks for pulling down structures to create fire breaks. They carried scent ones, heavy wet blankets used to smother smaller fires. They patrolled constantly, day and night, in rotating shifts, walking the streets of their assigned regions, watching for smoke, watching for fire, watching for the glow of an unattended brazier in a window. And while they watched for fire, they watched for everything else too. A patrol of vigiles walking a street at 2 in the morning was simultaneously a fire prevention unit and a law enforcement presence. Their job description included arresting burglars caught in the act, detaining runaway slaves, and breaking up disturbances. They had the authority to drag someone before the prefect of the vigiles, a senior official who functioned essentially as a magistrate for street-level crime. But here's the detail that reveals how Rome actually worked. The vigiles were not soldiers. They were not heavily armed. They didn't carry swords on patrol. They carried clubs, axes, fire equipment. They worked by presence and authority rather than by force. The message their patrol sent was not, "We will defeat you in a fight." The message was, "Someone is watching. Someone is always watching." In a city of perpetual darkness after sunset, the flickering torch of a vigiles patrol was both a physical safety measure and a psychological one. Now, let's talk about the night, because the night was the real problem. Rome had a law, ancient, dating back centuries before Augustus, that prohibited wheeled vehicles from operating within the city during daylight hours. Carts, wagons, delivery vehicles of all kinds were banned from the streets of Rome from sunrise to roughly the 10th hour of the day. This sounds insane, but the logic was brutally practical. Rome's streets were so narrow, many of them less than 4 meters wide, that wheel traffic during the day would have made the city completely impassable for the foot traffic of 1 million people going about their daily business. The ban kept the streets functional during business hours, but it meant that all of Rome's commercial deliveries happened at night. Every night, all night, hundreds of wagons, carts, and delivery vehicles flooded the streets of Rome from sunset to sunrise. The noise was extraordinary. Juvenal complained that it was impossible to sleep in Rome because of the constant grinding of iron-rimmed wheels on stone pavement. The streets that were dark and dangerous for pedestrians were simultaneously clogged with commercial traffic. This created a specific crime environment that the vigiles had to navigate. The delivery wagons were targets. The drivers were sometimes victims. Organized gangs knew which routes carried valuable cargo and when. The darkness made interception easy and identification nearly impossible. The vigiles' response was systematic. Fixed patrol routes on the major delivery corridors, checkpoint presence at key junctions, and, critically, an informer network. Rome ran on informers. The Latin word was delators, denouncers. And while the formal delator system was primarily a political tool used in upper-class prosecutions, the informal version of it permeated every level of Roman society. Tavern keepers reported suspicious conversations. Slave owners reported the movements of their slaves and noticed strangers. The Vico Magistri reported to the vigiles what they had seen and heard in their neighborhoods. Information moved upward constantly. The result was that even in a city of 1 million people with no modern forensics, no photographs, no databases, criminals were often caught. Not through investigation, through the social pressure of a community where someone was always watching, always listening, always willing to talk. But what about the organized gangs? Because here's what the vigiles could not handle. Rome in the late Republic and early Empire had genuine organized criminal enterprises operating in the city. The most famous were the gangs of politically connected strongmen. The most notorious being the force assembled by Publius Clodius Pulcher in the dying years of the Republic. His gang controlled entire neighborhoods, intimidated voters, beat up political opponents, and operated with near-total impunity because their leader had political protection at the highest levels. Rome's answer to this level of threat was not the vigiles. Rome's answer was the cohorts urbani, the urban cohorts. 3 cohorts, later expanded to 4, of heavily armed soldiers stationed within the city itself. Each cohort numbered around 500 men. They were organized along military lines, armed with military weapons, and commanded by military officers. They were essentially riot police before riot police existed. The urban cohorts handled situations the vigiles couldn't. Large-scale disturbances, organized resistance, situations where the authority of a watchman with a club was insufficient. They could deploy in formation. They could use lethal force. And their mere existence in the city was a constant reminder that Rome's tolerance for organized defiance had a very hard limit. Above even the urban cohorts sat the Praetorian Guard, 9,000 elite soldiers whose primary function was protecting the emperor, but whose presence in and around Rome created a final, ultimate layer of deterrence. A city that had vigiles on every street corner, urban cohorts in reserve, and Praetorians at the palace was a city that had constructed, with extraordinary deliberateness, a force spectrum that could respond to anything from a tavern brawl to a full-scale urban uprising. Nothing like this existed anywhere else in the ancient world. Let's slow down for a moment and make this human, because it's easy to talk about systems and cohorts and patrol routes as abstractions. But there was a real person living inside this system. Her name doesn't survive in the historical record. Let's call her Flavia, a fictional but realistic composite drawn from what we know about how ordinary Romans lived. Flavia lived on the 5th floor of an insula in the Subura neighborhood, the densest, loudest, most dangerous district in Rome. The Subura sat in a valley between the Esquiline and Viminal hills, a natural depression that collected noise and heat and the overflow from Rome's sewer system when it rained heavily. Her apartment was 1 room, maybe 15 feet square. She shared it with her husband and 2 children. The walls were thin enough to hear the family next door arguing. The floor was bare wood. Heat came from a single brazier, which she managed with obsessive care because she knew, with the certainty of someone who had watched buildings burn, exactly what happened when a brazier was left unattended. Every night, before she slept, she checked it. Every night. She woke before dawn to carry water. The nearest public fountain was 2 streets away and 3 floors down. She made that trip twice a day, minimum. Once in the early morning, once in the evening. 4 flights of stairs each time, with a heavy clay jug. She knew the Vigila's patrol by sound before she saw them. The shuffle of sandals on stone, the creak of leather, the occasional murmur of conversation. When she heard that sound at night, lying awake in the dark, listening to the city breathe, she felt something complicated, not quite safety. Rome was too honest a city to offer actual safety, but awareness, the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was paying attention. That was what Rome offered its people instead of safety. Attention. And sometimes, in a city of a million strangers, attention was enough. Now let's talk about what happened when the system failed. Because it did fail. Regularly. Dramatically. And the consequences were catastrophic. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD is the most famous example. Under Nero, fire broke out near the Circus Maximus and burned for 6 days. Then, after appearing to be nearly contained, it reignited and burned for 3 more. 10 of Rome's 14 regions were damaged. 3 were completely destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people were made homeless overnight. Was it arson? Accident? The historical debate continues. But what the fire revealed, regardless of its cause, was the fundamental vulnerability at the heart of Rome's crime and safety system. It was reactive, not preventive. The Vigiles could respond to a fire. They could contain a small fire. They could pull down buildings to stop a fire from spreading. But when fire moved faster than human response, when it jumped from building to building in the middle of the night while people slept, there was nothing anyone could do. Nero responded by rebuilding Rome with wider streets, lower buildings, mandatory fire breaks between structures, and required storage of firefighting equipment in every building. These were genuinely effective reforms. The Rome that rose from the ashes of 64 AD was meaningfully less combustible than the Rome that had burned. But the lesson of the Great Fire was also the lesson of Rome's entire approach to crime and disorder. The system was only as good as its enforcement. When enforcement slipped, when Vigiles patrols were understaffed, when the Vica Magistri were corrupt, when the urban cohorts were pulled away for political purposes, the city's crime rate spiked immediately. Rome had no institutional resilience below its active enforcement layer. No passive safety mechanisms. It was held together, always, by the active presence of people whose job it was to hold it together. Remove those people, and the city reverted, fast and hard, to something much more dangerous. Let's compare, because Rome's system looks extraordinary until you compare it to what came after. Medieval European cities of comparable population, and none of them came close to Rome's peak of 1 million, because it took Europe nearly 15 centuries to produce another city of that scale, had almost nothing. London in the medieval period had no professional law enforcement at all. The night watch was performed by citizen volunteers, often old men, often drunk, universally ineffective. Crime in medieval London was primarily controlled by the same mechanism that had been the baseline in Rome: community, social pressure. Your neighbors knew you. Your guild knew you. Your parish knew you. But London had none of Rome's formal institutional layers. No vigiles. No urban cohorts. No systematically organized neighborhood administration. The result was a city that contemporaries described as significantly more dangerous than Rome had been at its peak, despite being a fraction of size. It took London until 1829, 1800 years after Augustus created the Vigiles, to establish the Metropolitan Police, the world's first modern professional police force. 1800 years.